My name is Ameya Pawar. I'm the alderman of the 47th Ward. I threw my hat in the ring for the Democratic nomination for governor in January because I believe in social justice, and I believe in fairness, and I believe in equity. I believe that most people around the state share in these values. But if we elect people who hate government, or if we elect people who hate public institutions or who seek to destroy them, I don't think anything ever changes, and I firmly believe that none of the values that most of us share, social justice, equity, and fairness, will be embodied at any level of government. So I think this election is about the intersection of race and class. I think we have to be able to bring people together and transcend race and class. But I think it's important to recognize that the tone and temperature in this country, the rhetoric, we're in a really ugly place. So I was at a Democratic breakfast in Springfield last week, or a couple weeks ago, and I was giving a talk about what I think was happening in this country. And I talked about Charlottesville for a second. The thing is, it is important to be outraged about Charlottesville. White supremacy is something we need to fight. But just know that Charlottesville only happens at the end of a line, after a series of actions, racist policies, and really ugly rhetoric. Do you know what's at the front of that line? Is when we elect people who pit communities against one another based on where they live, what they look like, based on class, based on whether they work in a union or not. That is how you eventually end up with Charlottesville. But it starts when people like Bruce Rauner come into office and pit school funding with one community against the next. When Bruce Rauner talks about wanting to increase ballot access or make sure more people vote and that there are more competitive elections through redistricting reform, but then spends a year talking about how he won't sign automatic voter registration. See, all of these things pit people against one another. All of these things eventually lead to people hating one another. And I reject that. I reject regionalism. I reject the idea that there is a divide between rural communities and urban areas. Those things exist in every society. But the idea that we're all so different from one another is a myth that's perpetuated by people, particularly very wealthy people, who don't want anything to change at the top. So they keep everyone at the bottom fighting over scraps. And the way they do that is to divide people up based on what they look like and where they live and what they do for a living. And so to close, I just wanted to say, this is a tactic of divide and rule that's been used for millennia. It's been used by various regimes and elected leaders, and it's one that my parents had to experience, one that my dad grew up in. So he was born in India under British rule. And that's how the British ruled over the Indians. They divided Indians up based on where they live and what they look like, the religion they practiced. So a tiny minority, the wealthy, ruled over the majority. And that's exactly what's happening in our country. That's what this election is about. So it's important to transcend race and class, but recognize that poor white communities are struggling in the same way that poor black and brown communities are. And until we recognize that there are the common inequities that tie us all together, and until we recognize that, we're going to keep letting people like Bruce Rauner divide us based on where we live and what we look like. So thank you for having me here today, and we'll talk more about this, as I'm sure. Thank you.
To dig into this conversation a little bit further, I'd like to invite Ben Berlin from World Business Chicago to the stage. Ben is a CLA member and the head of strategic partnerships for World Business Chicago, and additionally is expecting a child literally as we speak. So we thank him for being here tonight, and with that, Ben Berlin.
Thank you, Alderman Pawar, for coming, and thanks everybody for joining us. Alderman Pawar, you mentioned that this election is really founded on race and class. I think one of the biggest issues that's always associated with those is the use of marijuana. And I wasn't going to ask about it, but I think about half of Kennedy's questions were about it. So just to continue down that road, what are your thoughts on marijuana legalization for the state of Illinois?
So, great question. Thank you. Let me be very quick on part of the answer and then give me a minute on the second part, which is, I was the first candidate to come out in favor of legalizing and regulating and taxing marijuana. I also think it's important to recognize why it is a social justice issue. So, when I'm out on the stump and I'm talking to people about race and class, the example that I use is the war on drugs. See, there are some people who believe that the war on drugs was a failure. I believe the war on drugs was a success because the people who believe it was a failure misunderstand history. Because the war on drugs was never a war against drugs. It was a war against black people. And I know this because when jobs started leaving inner cities and urban areas 40 years ago because of bad trade deals and automation, we didn't follow up those job losses with investment or social service provision. We created a racist war on drugs, and we broke up black and brown families. We criminalized drug possession or a public health issue. But today, now that those same kinds of jobs are leaving smaller towns or company towns or white communities, with the same issues come up. Poverty rates have gone up. Life expectancy for middle-aged white men has gone down. And it's not crack and cocaine that's moved in. It's opiates. But today, we call it a public health issue. So, one of the things about criminal justice reform is not only is it about legalizing and taxing and regulating marijuana, but it's also commuting the sentences of people who are wasting away in prisons when we're willing to treat white people for those problems today that ravaged black and brown communities 40 years ago. So if we have to look at this holistically and recognize that we can either continue mass incarceration or we can recognize that the underlying issue, what undergirds what's happening in predominantly white communities today, are the same things that ravage black and brown communities over the last 40 years. And that's when people lose their jobs and they lose hope, things happen. And if we're not willing to address the underlying issues, then nothing ever changes.
Thank you. Moving into a bit of a lighter area, in reading a little bit about you, saw that you're leading the 47th Ward. Could you maybe share a little bit about the first race in 2011 and kind of what it took for you to get to be alderman and what you learned from that you can apply if you become governor of the state of Illinois?
So is anyone here a constituent or live in the 47th Ward? Hello? Yeah. Welcome. So I threw my hat in the ring for alderman because of what I saw happen in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So I saw politicians and policymakers get on TV and blame poor people for poverty. And so that drew me to politics because I wanted to break the narrative of deserving and undeserving in public policy. But I didn't have any money. I didn't have any endorsements. So I just decided to knock on every single door in my ward. And, while people in the party told me I didn't stand a chance, I made a decision then that guides my decision-making process today, and it's that I don't worry about what insiders or pundits say about my chances, because if you do that, then, like with anything in your life, you put your life in someone else's hands. So I just knocked on every single door and put myself in a position that if there was an opening, that I'd be able to win. And there was one. My predecessor dropped out in January, tried to install a successor, and I'd already been knocking on doors for 2 years, talking to people, and that was the opening. So it wasn't luck. I created the opportunity, I created my own luck by making sure that I hustled the people who were running against me. I think it's the same thing in this race in the sense that I can't knock on every single door, but we've made it a priority to visit every single county in the state because I don't believe you write people off based on who they voted for in the last election. So I've spent a lot of my time in counties that, well, most of the state is red. It's not blue. Well, it's a blue state, but for a few counties, it's a Republican state. So it's important to go talk to people, because if you're running to represent everybody, talking to Trump voters is important. And so I've spent a lot of my time hustling my way around the state, having the conversation around race and class, and pointing out the fact that what Bruce Rauner does really well is he goes to poor white people in small towns and tells them that the reason why they don't get ahead is because those people in Cook County get more than their fair share. And he pits poor white people against poor black and brown people. And that's how nothing at the top ever changes. And so I feel like it's important that the lesson that I learned in my first race is show up, talk to people, don't write them off, out-hustle your opponents, and you can make up for money with sweat. Can't always do it. I don't have $1 billion, but I think, we've run a campaign based on getting out there and talking to people.
So the people, that's obviously a very large part of how you became alderman, and it's a big part of your platform for running for governor. I saw one of your slogans, Power for the People. I like that. It made me think of Power to the People, which was kind of nice in my head. But being on the people front, people are very different. You said it yourself, this is mostly a red state, aside for Chicago, maybe a few others. If you become governor, what unique approach would you take to balancing the differing viewpoints of these people?
Well, I think it's recognizing that as Illinoisans, we rise and fall together, and that while there are divides based on where people live, and that's in every society, most people want the same things. They want strong public schools, they want a good job, they want to have a good job that hopefully gets them ahead over time. So everyone wants the same things, and it's about appealing to our common humanity. And so I don't think people wake up in the morning, regardless of where they live or who they voted for in the last election, and see a Democrat or Republican staring back at them. I think people like me force people to choose come election time, and that's a good thing, but I don't think people necessarily define themselves, well, probably pre-Trump, just based on political ideology. And so what we're proposing is a new deal, one that invests in the things that most people want: public schools, public institutions, infrastructure so you can actually put people back to work and combat the next wave of automation that's coming, that's going to hit fields like trucking or fast food or hospitality. And I think the only way to do that is to recognize that as the economy changes over the next 10, 15 years, as machines start replacing people in certain fields, waiting for those changes to take place before enacting policies to address the underlying issues, like I talked about in the war on drugs, is a mistake. And that's why we spend a lot of time going and talking to people and proposing policies that appeal to everybody and make it less partisan, but make it more about Illinois rising and falling together.
So we have time for one more question. And this is a question that I always like to ask our group of fellows when we have somebody special in the room. But how can we, the millennial leaders of Chicago, the audience right here in front of us, how can we best partner with our elected officials to make collective positive impact on the state?
I think that's a great question, because I think it starts with recognizing that our public institutions need investment, and that public institutions are good, and that government can be a force for good if you elect people who believe in government. Government is not a business, nor should it be run like one. And that means we all get angry and we show up to our elected officials when there's a zoning decision you don't like or a policy change at the state or federal level. That's easy to do. It's easy to be reactionary, but the hard work is to be involved when times are good and you're not worried about anything, or when the rhetoric isn't so ugly, and stay involved in that process and hold your elected officials accountable, but participate in their process. That's what I would do. Because I think if we react and constantly react, then you're just reacting with anger, and anger is not sustainable.
Thank you so much.
Open it up for the crowd now. Do we have any questions? First for Ben. When did you win the Masters? I'm kidding, but all right.
You kind of identified your platform and the challenges behind that as an issue of the intersection of race and class. Sorry. Those topics are things that are hard conversations. And when you talk about downstate and some of the areas outside Chicago, how do you really plan on addressing that with people who aren't used to having that conversation and quite frankly may or may not want to?
Yeah, so did everyone hear the question? Yeah, I'll do my best and tell me if I did it justice. How do you have the conversation about race and class outside of the city of Chicago where people may or may not want to have that conversation? I don't know that everyone in Chicago wants to have that conversation. Having a conversation about institutional racism doesn't mean I'm accusing you of being racist. But if we can't talk about institutional racism, then we're all party to institutionalizing it. So the way that's why I use the war on drugs as an example, is because the war on drugs, yes, it criminalized drug possession and it criminalized black people. Now, I think people can see that from a systemic perspective because they're seeing what's happening in poor white communities now. People are seeing the impacts of opiate addiction. I mean, life expectancy for middle-aged men in small towns has gone down that rivals developing nations. So people are more socially isolated now as a result of company towns folding. So I think people can see that from a systemic perspective because we're not accusing them of being racist, nor should we. And I also think it's important to address this from a perspective of this is a tactic that's been used for millennia. Keeping poor white people divided against poor black and brown people is the way that nothing ever changes, right? Because you tell poor white people that it's those people's fault. I mean, that's essentially what Governor Rauner has been doing for the last 2 years about school funding. It's like, it's those people in Cook County or Chicago public schools or prisons, right? It's code words. It's their prisons. Their teachers are illiterate. And then he goes to poor white communities and tells them that. And then they think, well, look at those schools. They're terrible. And those people are getting what I should get in my community. When the truth is no one's getting their fair share. And think about who's perpetuating that conversation. It's a few very, very wealthy people whose interest it is to keep people divided at the bottom. And I know it's a hard question, but a hard conversation. But if we don't have it, and if we're not willing to have it, then this stuff like Charlottesville, it's going to get worse because automation is going to devastate other industries like trucking, which primarily it's middle-aged white men. So if we're not talking about it today, we've got some scary times ahead of us, and so I'm in it to force the conversation.
Thank you for being here. I think your message about equality and social justice is fantastic. I wanted to dovetail on the point you just made about this being a race about race and class, and wonder what your thoughts around campaign finance reform might be. We've heard about it from the other candidates, but I'm interested in yours.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so let me answer that a couple ways. One, there's too much money in politics, right? And the idea that one person can underwrite the entire party is a major problem. It makes it really hard to have any real marketplace for ideas. Because if you're dependent on one person or two people or a small network of folks, it's really hard to oppose those people when you're dependent on them to run for office. So I believe in public financing of campaigns. I also think, though, some of it rests on you guys, which is, we talk about campaign finance reform, but do we take candidates who don't always have the most money seriously? And so that means some of it has to come down to is we can't always buy the political ads and the mail pieces that a few 25-year-old consultants write, hook, line, and sinker. It requires the electorate actually caring about listening to people who may not be the front runners and actually getting involved. because that's how you get the campaign finance reform as well, because you're a part of that. Tightening the rules is fine, but you guys have to take people seriously who don't have money either.
Last question.
Yeah, if you were governor, what policy and legislative levers would you use to unify Illinois along the lines of race and class?
So what policy levers would I use to unify the state? That's a great question because, the frame of our campaign is a New Deal for Illinois. And I am a big fan of FDR for the New Deal. He did some other things that I could never agree with. But the New Deal was interesting because at a time after the Depression, when the economy was totally out of whack, he forged a coalition that didn't ever exist before with factory workers and farmers, with labor and business executives around this idea that you needed to rebalance the economy. So they went big on infrastructure because they needed to restore dignity to work, pay a decent wage, and make sure that there was a pathway to the middle class. In the same way that the best way I believe to combat automation is we know that the jobs of the future are in green technology, or the jobs of the future are, the next wave of blue-collar jobs might be in coding. But if a 50-year-old trucker loses their job to a computer driving his truck, a $60,000 a year job, asking that person to go to community college for 2 years to be a coder is a non-starter. So we need to create a pathway to the jobs of the future, but there needs to be a bridge from the jobs that are changing today, and that bridge has to be done through infrastructure. And I think that New Deal, going big on public works, having a place for people to work and land as the economy changes over the next 10 years is the best way to do it. Because you can't automate construction, you can't automate all public works just yet. And people need to feel productive, and they need to be paid a living wage. And I think every community around this state has seen disinvestment. This is the story of our country. We built it, and we stopped maintaining it and stopped taking care of it. So now we have an opportunity to actually start rebuilding.
And we actually got one more.
So given that race and class are really based on education, that being the big divide, can you talk a little bit about your approach to education and how it might differ from some of the other candidates?
I think the good thing is we're all talking about progressive taxation. We're all talking about equitable funding for public schools. But the one thing that I think is important when we talk about equity, and if we're going to lift all boats, is that equity does not mean equal. Equity means spending more money where it's needed. And that means that it is in many ways a redistribution, because if kids are coming to school hungry, there is a cognitive impact. There's an impact on their development. And so we need to provide wraparound services. We need to make sure that the kids aren't going hungry, which we do, but it's providing all the other supportive services that a kid from a more privileged household has. And so that means when we're thinking about spending more money, it really does come down to more money, less testing, accountability on teachers' unions is just ridiculous. It's really about spending more money, and more money means the pie needs to be significantly bigger. And then spending more money in communities that need it the most. That is how I define equity. That is, I think, what sets us apart.
With that, can we get a huge round of applause for Ald Ameya Pawar?
Thank you.